The YouTube is live now. YouTube is live now.
Can everyone see the slide? By the way, I just want to check that it's
Yes,
working.
yes, we can.
You can see the slide?
Yes.
And you can hear me?
Yes, yes.
Okay, thank you. Sounds good. And then when I change slides, is it changing?
Yes.
Can you see the move? Okay, thank you.
You can make it full screen. Yeah. Maybe you can make it the full.
No, he has to make
from his
Yeah. Actually, instead of sharing the PPT, if he has shared the whole screen, then
it will be okay.
No, we can. This is Google Meet.
Google.
We can just make it full screen. Not from my, not from our side.
hello sir, can you make the full screen?
Yeah. Let me see that. Okay. The full screen with the slide?
Yeah. So now you are sharing. Yes, now you actually share the PPT. In case if you could have shared the whole screen, then.
Okay, I'll do that. Okay. Can you see that? Is that better?
It's the same.
Better.
So could you share your PPT once more?
Not the full screen.
Yeah, it's not coming up right now, right?
It's not coming up right now.
So you minimize the browser.
Yeah, okay, got it. Okay, give me a second.
Yeah, now it's better, no? Let him share this.
So I don't think it's. Oh, that's the screen again. Hold on.
So you minimize it. You minimize this browser and open the PPT.
Okay. Yeah.
Come this side.
Okay, minimize. And you open the PPT.
Yeah, I've opened it now. Can you see?
You minimize this one also. This browser.
Sir, from our end, it looks like your browser is still on your screen. So if you can, go to PowerPoint and start the slideshow on your presentation, I think we'll be able to view it then.
Okay, how about now? Can you see that?
No, strangely not.
Okay. Were you ever able to see the slides?
Yes.
Like initially the slides was there.
Initially you can see the slides, yes.
Okay, I think that's the best option, right?
Right. Let's just stick with that.
Yeah. Okay. Let me stop this.
Share me the PPT.
Then you can see, right?
Right, we can see this.
Let it be. Yeah.
I think let's go with that. I'll start it here and then
Sure.
dig up.
Yeah.
So okay, can you just tell me when I switch slides, can you see that switching?
Yes. Yes.
Yes, we can see.
Mute you.
Can you see that? Okay, great. Let's stay with this so I don't
Yeah.
I think we can quit. That's okay with you.
You could mute it.
No, unmute. No. Now we can start. I think. No? Starting.
Shall I ask him to start?
Yeah.
So we can start now.
No. Just wait a little bit. Introduce. Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
so we'll have an introduction from
Yeah.
Professor Mislesh Shah. And after that.
Yeah.
Sounds good.
Hello
And
everyone.
I'll start the slides.
Yeah. Yeah.
And we're-
Hello everyone. First of all, we are very grateful to Tejas for agreeing to deliver this talk, and he is joining us online from a very different time zone. We are really grateful to you, Tejas, for your kind acceptance of my invitation. Tejas will be speaking on radical democracy in modern Indian political thought. To some of you who may not be familiar with Tejas and his work, I'd just like to briefly introduce him. He's assistant professor of political theory at University of California, Los Angeles. He received his PhD in political theory from the University of Chicago in 2019. And he was a former junior research fellow in political thought and intellectual history at King's College, University of Cambridge, and also a winner of 2024 Political Theory Prize by ECPR. Today, he will be speaking about his book, Radical Democracy in Modern Indian Political Thought. And I guess Tejas can speak for about 35 to 40 minutes maybe, or 45 minutes, and then we can have Q&A session. So over to you, Tejas.
Perfect. Thank you. Can everyone hear me okay? I'll share the screen in a second, but you can hear me okay? Okay,
Yes, we
perfect.
can hear you.
Thank you. Okay, let me just start this slideshow. Okay, great. Well, thank you, everyone. Thank you for coming. It's great to see you all, though virtually. I would have loved to do this in person, especially because I've never been to Guwahati, so I would have been very eager to come. But it's the middle of my semester, so we'll have to settle for this remote talk. But thank you so much for the invitation, both to the department, to IIT Guwahati, and especially to Regulation. Okay, so as was mentioned, I'm going to be speaking about my book, Radical Democracy in Modern Indian Political Thought, which is published by Cambridge University Press in the Ideas in Context series, and I'll speak for around 40 minutes. And if I cut out or anything at any time, then please just, or if you stop seeing the screen, then please just call out and fix things. Okay. Great. So one of the most significant geopolitical developments of the 20th century was the one that's illustrated on this map, namely the gradual demise of European imperial rule over much of Asia, Africa, and the Caribbean through the middle decades of the century. The question I'm interested in is how we might understand this process of imperial transformation and eventual disintegration as an intellectual movement. So, to put it differently, how do we understand the kinds of political ideas that were produced by the crisis of empire in the 20th century? How do we best understand the kind of political and intellectual tradition that we often call modern anti-colonialism? The kind of the intellectual response to the crisis of empire. In a lecture on political freedom delivered in 1966, later published in the book on the left, the political philosopher Hannah Arendt argued that, quote, the end of imperialism under the pressure of nationalism marked the global diffusion of the French Revolution and of its Jacobin ideals. So Arendt's answer to this question about sort of what is the intellectual content of the crisis of empire was that the crisis of empire in the 20th century had emerged in the shadow of the revolutions of the 18th century. So in some sense, it was a kind of repetition of history. And Arendt's observation in 1966 captured what was then an emerging consensus within political theory about the nature of anti-colonialism. This was that anti-colonialism had been a fundamentally diffusionist project. It was seeking to extend the kinds of political institutions and ideas which had triumphed in Western Europe after the Age of Revolution. So institutions like the nation state, like party politics, and most importantly, representative government as the expression of popular sovereignty. For Arendt in particular, what anti-colonial thinkers were seeking was not a break from these kinds of political forms, from the political forms of the nation state and representative democracy. They were really seeking the institutionalization of Jacobin Republican forms beyond Europe. And in her book on revolution, this actually became the gist of Arendt's critique of anti-colonialism. So she was quite apprehensive about anti-colonial nationalism as a whole, because of this kind of repetitive nature that she saw. That she thought that it was going to reproduce all the failures of the French Revolution, just in a new context, because of its attachment to the same kinds of institutional forms. And Arendt's diffusionist narrative was sketched out in a remarkably similar way by the political scientist Robert Emerson in a book titled From Empire to Nation, which is somewhat forgotten now, but it is really the first political science study of anti-colonial nationalism. So I think it's worth really returning to this book. Now, Emerson maintained that while anti-colonialism was often presented by its proponents as a struggle against Western domination, it in fact amounted to a quote, Europeanization of the globe. This was his phrase, the Europeanization of the globe. The intellectual origins of modern anti-colonialism for Emerson lay in the American and especially the French revolutions of the late 18th century. And like these earlier moments, anti-colonial nationalism was an attempt to embody the democratic will of a people, however defined, the democratic will of a people through the sovereignty of the nation state and through practices of electoral representation. And this, he said, was exactly what had happened in the French Revolution, and it was exactly what was now happening in the response to empire in Asia and Africa. As far as I know, Arendt and Emerson arrived at this narrative, this interpretation independently, so neither of them ever cited each other, but it is striking to me that they were kind of arguing more or less the same thing, at least in terms of their historiography, 6 years apart from one another. So it really shows the emergence of a certain kind of consensus around what anti-colonialism was. And this diffusionist paradigm, which emerged in the 1960s, is still largely the dominant interpretation of anti-colonial nationalism today. So in his book on the waves of democratization in the 20th century, Samuel Huntington famously classified anti-colonialism as part of a second wave, or the second wave of globalization of electoral government in the 20th century. So this is a wave from 1940-ish, sort of post-war year 1945 to 1970, that 25-year period. And anti-colonialism is part of this, what Huntington called the second wave. And more recently, in his book, The Wilsonian Moment, Erez Manela has interpreted anti-colonialism as a demand for precisely the kind of representative democracy which became a pillar of American liberal foreign policy after World War I under Woodrow Wilson, right? So liberal internationalism becomes attached to a certain kind of democracy, a representative electoral democracy, and for Manela, this is exactly the kind of government that anti-colonial nationalists demand and want to replicate. Now, my own view is not that a narrative which takes anti-colonialism to be the demand for representative government is necessarily wrong. So I don't want to argue that it's empirically incorrect, but that it's actually fundamentally incomplete, that it overlooks many other aspects and other strands of the broad tradition of anti-colonial politics. And more generally, I think, this narrative misunderstands in quite a profound sense what anti-colonialism in fact was as a body of political thought. So it paints with a very broad brush what was quite an internally diverse tradition, intellectual tradition, and in doing so, it misses what were some of the guiding concerns and priorities of many aspects of the tradition. So the book as a whole is really grows out of my dissatisfaction with what I believe is this kind of dominant narrative, dominant historiography and theoretical paradigm of understanding anti-colonial political thought. And it's a challenge to these kinds of long-established interpretations of nationalism, which see it as a kind of derivative discourse, seeking to reproduce already established structures of political representation. So the main thesis of the book, the main goal, is to challenge this historiography and to do so by recovering a federalist tradition from within 20th century South Asian political theory, which was quite critical of representative democracy, and to try and reconstruct what I think was its alternate vision of nationalism and popular sovereignty, and how it saw the relationship between nationalism and popular sovereignty. And this is a tradition that in the book I traced from the early 1920s to around the early 1970s, so about a half-century period. Now, in today's talk, I'm going to focus on chapter 2 of the book, which is titled The Genius of the People, the 1923 Constitution of Mysore. So this chapter looks at a draft constitution which was prepared for the state of Mysore in southern India by a political philosopher named Rajendra Seal or BNC, and I'll say more about him in a second. And this was a constitution that was never put into practice, but it was, just examining it as a draft, I think you get a sense of the scale of its ambition, theoretical ambition. There are a few archival copies of this draft constitution that are currently circulating. The one I'm going to be citing is stored at the India Office Records at the British Library. And I want to examine it today as an early and somewhat idiosyncratic example of the federalist democratic tradition that I discussed in the book. And as I said, this is a federalist democratic tradition that I think shows the limitations of the accepted paradigm, accepted historiography of anti-colonial political thought. And in the discussion later, I'm happy to say more about how this particular chapter, chapter 2, connects up with the larger arc of the book as a whole. So the central figure in my story for today is a man named Seal, Rajendra Seal. So I find Seal quite a fascinating figure. There's a reason I kind of devoted a section of the book to him. I taught some of his work at the graduate level here, and I always find it very instructive to read and to teach. And part of the reason is that Seal is the first person in India, as far as I've been able to tell, and one of the first people in the non-European world who in fact described himself as a political philosopher. So he uses this term, which I think is very interesting. He taught the very first classes in modern political and legal philosophy at an Indian university. So his writings are interesting not just for the substance of their arguments or what he has to say, but also for their form, structure, and presentation. So they reveal a lot about how political theory itself came to be globalized as an kind of emerging academic discipline in the early 20th century. So Seal, I have on the slide there a kind of brief recap of his biography. He's very much a kind of figure of the late 19th century. He is born in Calcutta to a lawyer's family in 1864, and he receives a kind of broadly bilingual education at Scottish institutions, sort of Presbyterian missionary institutions, which is pretty standard for young men of that social class and that generation. But in the 1880s and 1890s, Seal begins an academic career in the discipline that was then called moral philosophy or moral sciences at first at some institutions in Bengal and then moves to Mysore. So in beginning his academic career in the 1880s, Seal's main preoccupation comes to be with what philosophy itself means within an interconnected global society. So he's one of these, these philosophers or these social scientists who are really interested in philosophy itself as a mode of discipline. The kind of social scientists who like to write about social science itself. And so his specific interest is on the question of what it even means to do philosophy in India. What does philosophy in India mean in comparison to philosophy in Europe? Right? What's the relationship between these two? And in 1903, Seal published a collection of essays entitled New Essays in Criticism, where he challenged this premise that the development of philosophy in the non-European world would follow the same trajectory as it did in Europe. That it would pass through similar stages, it would use similar methods and categories, and that it would arrive at generally similar conclusions. So the premise he was challenging here is this idea that you could do philosophy in a place like India, you could study philosophy in a place like India or in other Asian societies in the way that you study philosophy in Europe, that it would follow the same story. And this was a premise that Seal associated most closely with George Friedrich Hegel's philosophy of world history from the 1820s, where Hegel had taken the historical development of Western Europe as a metric with which to evaluate the rest of the world, right? Leading to Hegel's well-known formulation of historical progress as having culminated in Western European modernity. This is a famous conclusion of Hegel's historiography, that everything else that is happening in the world, it can be evaluated through what is happening in Western Europe, and more specifically in Prussia in the early 19th century. And Seal rejected this, and in contrast to Hegel, Seal proposed taking each philosophical tradition that existed in the world as an independent, self-contained unit, undergoing its own trajectory of development. So a truly global approach to the history of philosophy, if such a thing could even exist, would entail departing from Hegelian interpretations of non-European intellectual life in European terms. So this is the key thesis that Seal begins to develop as an academic. And as he put it here, for instance, so this is from the New Essays in Criticism volume from 1903, which I mentioned earlier. And here Seal says, Hegel's view of historic development as a unilinear series can no longer be maintained. The Egypto-Babylonian, the Greco-Italian, the Indo-Sino-Japanese art series and culture histories cannot be evolved from one another and are relatively independent in origin as well as development. And he goes on to say at the bottom of that passage that the Hegelian conception of a punctual movement in a unilinear series is obsolete from the standpoint of the philosophy of history and the historic method. So his point here was that to study something like Indian thought or to study Egyptian thought or Japanese thought in terms of its approximation of already formulated modern European categories was to fail to treat it according to its own terms, right? That there was not just one path of development, a unilinear series that philosophy would follow globally, that each philosophical tradition was kind of evolving, as he put it here, on its own in its own terms and using its own kinds of forms of development. Okay? And this is what really Seal became known for in the early 20th century, in the first decade of the 20th century, as both a reader and a critic of Hegel. Someone trying to challenge what he saw as Hegel-influenced Eurocentric paradigms of global intellectual history. And so this is from 1903. After 1910 or so, Seal began to focus more specifically on the issue of political philosophy. Right? And so this is also when his academic affiliation shifted more towards political philosophy, from philosophy in a more general sense, or moral philosophy in a more general sense. So if, as he was putting it here in this passage, the history of Indian philosophy or Indo-Sino-Japanese philosophy could not be seen as just as a mirror image of European philosophy, then what were we to make of Indian thinking about things like the state, government, citizenship? Did these categories even mean anything? Right? And how did the formation of the state on the subcontinent, for instance, relate to the formation of the state in Europe? What comparisons could we draw? And Seal supplied a similar answer here on the question of politics. that political ideas and political forms in India and in the rest of the non-European world had not simply followed the path of political ideas and forms in Europe. So the state in India had not emerged in the same way that the state had emerged in Europe. It had not emerged at the same time, and it had not, what it looked like was also very different. Right? So the study of political development in non-European societies needed to be approached as the study of distinctive families of ideas about self and sovereignty that were rooted in vernacular tradition. So essentially the kind of thing that he was saying here about philosophy in a general sense, he came to say about politics, right? That politics, political traditions were, quote, also relatively independent in origin as well as development. And so to study politics in any region properly, it was necessary to study it according to its own kind of trajectory of development and to identify that trajectory of development. And Seal made this point very clear in 1911 when he was invited to address a meeting called the Universal Races Congress in London. So the Congress, which is pictured here, was a fascinating moment in this kind of early emergence of internationalism, where you had delegates from the Americas, from West Africa, and from South and East Asia coming together to debate questions of race, politics, and empire in the early 20th century. And so Seal was invited to give the opening address to the Universal Races Congress. And he used the address to lay out his theory of politics, building on the kinds of arguments that we just discussed. And he said, quote, so this is from the speech, that, quote, a nation, then, is a conscious social personality, exercising rational choice as determined by a scheme of ideal ends or values, and having an organ, the state, for announcing and executing its will. And it goes on to say that, quote, all members of a truly national state are integral members of a composite personality, but the individual units are themselves persons. So the thing here, his topic was the relationship between something that he called the national personality, the nation, as a conscious social personality, and another thing that he called the state, right? And so the nation exercised its will and announced its will, as he put it here, through this institution, this organ called the state. So this relationship between national communities and the state is a very Hegelian topic. It had been something that Hegel himself had written about. And while the state was common to all human communities, which had developed beyond living in self-contained, isolated settlements, Seal held that its actual form would vary according to the historical norms and values of each community. So this thing called the national personality. So the nature of a national personality, right, this kind of scheme of ideal ends or values that existed within any given national personality would determine the nature of that organ, its organ, the state. Right? And so Seal went on in his lecture to insist that because of this relationship between national personality and statehood, there was in fact no universal standard for statehood. This is where he departed from Hegel. There were as many iterations of the state as there were national personalities. And he used the case of Imperial Japan following the Meiji Restoration to demonstrate how a highly centralized modern regime could be shaped by a pre-existing tradition of deified imperial sovereignty, right? So the Japanese emperor, the position that the Japanese emperor occupied in the Japanese state becomes a kind of key illustration of this fact for Seal, because the Japanese state of 1911 was not just a replica of the German state of the late 19th or early 20th century. So Japanese modernity was not just an extension of German modernity into East Asia, which is what a straightforward Hegelian perspective would hold. But Seal held that you could only properly understand the state as it had developed in modern Japan if you understood what had come before, namely the cult of the emperor, right? The thing that had preceded the Meiji Restoration that had become further consolidated in subsequent decades. So the nature of the Japanese state, which is so centralized and so modern, but is again dependent, contingent on national personality, comes to illustrate the contingency of state formation on existing vernacular regional traditions. And this London lecture in 1911 brought to the study of the state Seale's broader methodological criticism of Hegelian notions of unilinear historical development, the kind of thing he had associated with Hegelian philosophies of history. So what was the implication of this? The implication was that ideas and forms of sovereignty in Indian history would diverge from existing European templates of sovereignty and statehood. And this is really what Seale became known for within Indian national circles in the 1910s and early 1920s, as someone trying to reconstruct pre-modern Indian theories of the state and to compare them to the theories of sovereignty of Hobbes, Hegel, and John Stuart Mill. So you see, for the most part, as I'll talk about closer to the end of the talk, Seale doesn't seem to have had much political influence, direct political influence. He seems not to have had much interest in real politics, except for brief episodes. But he is cited a lot by Indian thinkers in the 1910s. And in the 1910s, he's primarily cited for this point of sort of trying to imagine or conceive of what an Indian form of state theory might look like. What kind of theories of the state that are attentive to the distinctiveness of Indian history would look like. That's really what he comes to be associated with, that kind of broad methodological paradigm. And it's this perceived expertise in Indian political philosophy which led Seale to be appointed as lead constitutional advisor for the state of Mysore in October 1922. So this is on the left there of the slide is an imperial gazetteer map from that year, that very year, 1922, and you can see kind of the borders of Mysore at the bottom. And as you of course know, Mysore is one of the 500 or so princely states which dot the territory of the subcontinent, and these are states which are governed indirectly, right? So the British government exercises control over military, taxation, foreign policy, but they still maintain local forms of usually monarchical rulership. And there's a whole complicated backstory of why Mysore decided to undertake constitutional reform in the 1920s, why Seale was appointed, what are the politics behind this. I go into it in the book. I won't go into it now just because it's kind of a side story, but I'm happy to talk more about it later on if anyone is interested. There's a whole story here that's kind of in the background about constitutional thinking and thinking on democracy and statehood within the states. Setting the stage for the document we'll discuss, right? But so I'm happy to talk more about that later on. So essentially, Mysore is kind of compelled to undertake some constitutional reform in the early 1920s, and B.N. Seale, who has by then moved to the University of Mysore to take up the post of Vice Chancellor, is asked to serve on the committee that is appointed to propose a set of constitutional reforms. So the right of the slide, figure 7, is a scan that I've made of the front page of this report as it's stored in the office records. The Constitutional Developments in Mysore Committee. It's also called the BNCA Committee, and it bears its name. So the report as a whole is a really fascinating document. It has two sections. It opens with a lengthy essay in which the committee, specifically B.N. Seale, outlines their underlying political philosophy, so their guiding ideals, and then the second half of the document is a kind of draft constitution. Right? And in the opening essay, Seale wrote that, quote, a new constitution, in the first place it says, a constitution is not made but grows. The new plan, speaking of the project he's engaged in, the new plan must evolve out of historic conditions and traditions in response to new needs and new facts. And in Mysore, he continued, we have had certain unique constitutional and ultra-constitutional developments in the past. Now, this kind of language, this is how the report starts. This is Article 2. So this kind of language shouldn't surprise us given what we've just seen about Seale's long-standing critique of Hegelian and unilinear approaches to state formation, right? So in Seal's organicist kind of view of political development, of state theory, a constitution itself needed to be an evolutionary product of established, quote, what he called here, quote, historic conditions and traditions, right? So the goal of state formation and the goal of constitution writing was to formulate a political community rooted in a region's existing social and political practices. So a constitution writer, the framers of the constitution, of any constitution, had to do what he thought that good political scientists and good philosophers had to do, which is to examine a region's kind of existing practices and beliefs and so on, and then to devise a certain kind of system based on those existing practices. Right? So the goal of constitution writing is then similar to the goal of the social scientist to the goal of the philosopher. So what does this exactly mean though? What do we mean here? Because then Seal says, as we can see, that in Mysore we have had certain unique constitutional and ultra-constitutional development. So what are these? Right? And so if we are to pay attention to historic conditions and traditions, what kind of constitution do we actually end up with? So Seal specified two main historic conditions, two aspects to this kind of historic conditions in the region around Mysore. The first was monarchical rule, and this was quite obvious for him. Seal argued that from approximately the 14th century onwards, the region around Mysore, which became later the princely state of Mysore, had always been governed by royal dynasties. He took this for granted. So the issue, the notion of sovereignty, namely the power of lawmaking, derived from the sanction of a single ruler. The personhood of the ruler contained within itself the final authorization for all political action within the borders of the state. And again, Seal here turned to the Japanese example as his model. So he says, quote, as in the case of the Mikado or the Emperor of Japan, the ruler of Mysore represented the people directly and primarily in his person. Now you can see here there's a real obsession with Japan as a kind of comparative case in Indian political thought around World War I, and I'm happy to talk about this later on as well. We usually see the Japanese example, we see it as a later event, sort of, Shimachi goes as a kind of economic model, but there's an earlier moment of preoccupation with Japan on the question of state formation, so on, which Seal is very much a part of. So he sees there to be a relationship between the kind of prince of Mysore, the princely ruler, and the emperor, and repeatedly deploying the metaphor of the body politic, Seal described the Mysore ruler as a quote head of state. Okay, so that's the first aspect, right? Monarchical rule. The second aspect of Mysorean history, constitutional history, is that alongside the office of the monarch, the region around Mysore since the 14th century had also contained a network of local association assemblies, which Seal called primary assemblies, through which much of the actual work of lawmaking or the actual exercise of sovereignty happened. So these association assemblies could be both territorial, so based on neighborhood and jurisdiction, but also functional, so rooted in occupational groups such as guilds. So if the monarch was the head of state, then these primary assemblies were its various limbs and organs, and this is the language he used. And while primary assemblies, these associational assemblies, were subject to the final dictates of the monarch was still the kind of repository of sovereignty, in daily affairs, in their daily existence, they possessed considerable independence of legislation. So the history of sovereignty in southern India for Seal was a history essentially of divided government, a kind of federal government. And he put that very bluntly here. On page 4, Seal said in his report, these associations and assemblies had an independent origin and sanction. The state, even when it came to incorporate them and grant them charters, did not and could not wholly usurp suppress their quasi-independent character or usurp their jurisdiction or functions. So, despite their considerable power, successive monarchs of Mysore had allowed local populations to remain essentially self-governing through these kinds of associational assemblies. And then in their internal constitution, assemblies were these kind of participatory fora for collective deliberation and decision-making between their recognized members. Now, I'm happy to talk more during discussion again about where I think Seal was getting this history from, both of Mysore in particular, but maybe also generally of India, this kind of history of divided sovereignty. He's not the first one to be making this argument, and he's not even the first one to make this argument about Mysore. Okay, so Seal understood then sovereignty, the power of sovereignty, the power of lawmaking, to have been historically exercised in southern India on two parallel tracks: monarchical kingship on one hand, and these participatory local associations or these primary assemblies on the other. Notably absent from his account was anything resembling an electoral institution. He never made the argument that was made repeatedly by the first generation of Indian nationalist thinkers, that you could find versions of parliamentary democracy in Indian history. So Dadabhai Naoroji had made versions of this argument in the 1870s and 1880s. The young Gandhi had famously made a version of this argument in South Africa in the 1890s, that some form of parliamentary government had existed in Indian history, and therefore you could parliamentary government could be granted to British India. Seal never made this argument. Indeed, he argued instead that, quote, the political machinery of the orthodox parliamentary pattern, in which professional politicians were elected on the basis of a vote to legislate on behalf of a wider populace, had simply never existed in India. So he was adamant that, in fact, there was nothing like a parliamentary institution in pre-modern India. And instead, Seal held that this thing that he called the orthodox parliamentary pattern was a political system deriving specifically from Britain's political evolution after the civil wars and after the glorious revolution of the 17th century. So he put it in his opening essay that, quote, the British Constitution, which is the model set up in British India, secures representative and responsible government in one way, namely on the basis of empowering the elected representatives, end quote. And he held that such a system had simply never existed in the subcontinent, that there was no notion of an electoral representative, representation through electoral means, and through the mediating institution of political parties. So what did this mean? What's the implication? It followed that a theory of state formation rooted in southern India's historic conditions would need to be, first, federalist in its distribution of sovereignty, in its distribution of lawmaking powers, and secondly, it would need to avoid electoral democracy in its scheme of representation, because such a thing had simply never existed. And this is precisely what Seal's plan attempted to do. He outlined a three-tiered system of government for Mysore state. So I mentioned that this draft has two parts. So the opening essay lays out this philosophy of regional political development, and then the second section, which is the draft constitution, is where Seal lays out this kind of three-tiered system of government. At the apex of the top tier stood predictably the figure of the prince. So the monarch had powers to create and disband an executive council, to coordinate between subordinate bodies, and to hold authority over the state's relations with external actors. So the monarch is this kind of unelected executive officer, and he's very clear about it. It's like a president-like figure. The second tier, so this is at the top, the second tier of government contains two elected institutions, so a representative assembly and a legislative council. Election into both bodies was open to adult citizens of Mysore, so there's an aspiration here, at least, aspiration towards something like universal adult suffrage. Both the representative assembly and the legislative council are proposing legislation to the prince and to the council of ministers. What they are not are legislatures, elected legislatures. They have no independent lawmaking powers. And Seal was emphatic that the assembly and the council working together do not correspond to a double chamber of legislature. So this is not an elected bicameral legislature on a parliamentary model at all. It's simply a kind of consultative body. I think it will become clear in a second about what these intermediary institutions are exactly supposed to do. The most far-reaching recommendations of the report were focused on the third tier of Mysore's government, namely the sphere of local lawmaking. So Seal tried to make the primary assemblies, these kinds of associational assemblies that he had first discussed in his opening essay, into the foundation of Mysore's new constitution, into its quote ultimate constituent units, his own term. So, what did this mean? Well, first, every individual jurisdiction within Mysore would contain an assembly open to all its adult citizens. While associational assemblies had historically been prominent, Seal argued that by the early 20th century, many had become corrupted and had lost their original functions, and in many cases had simply disappeared. He underlined that these assemblies were to be revived and then reconstituted, put on modern liberal lines. So with an eye that is to removing barriers to participation based on caste, wealth, and gender, right? So part of what this kind of princely government is supposed to do is to construct these assemblies as these egalitarian spaces and to kind of create a anti-discrimination provisions to ensure equal participation. And we can talk more about how we think that's going to happen. So, and then once these reconstituted assemblies exist, the Seal's plan went on to give these primary assemblies three main powers. So to be sovereign over their discrete territories and over their members, so the power of lawmaking. Second, to put laws passed by the monarch to a referendum. And then third, to initiate legislation by submitting through submissions to the representative assembly and the legislative council. So that's really what these intermediary bodies, the legislative council and the representative assembly, do. They receive draft legislation from these primary assemblies and they pass it on as bills to the friends. So by giving rights of referendum and legislative initiation to appropriately reconstructed assemblies, Seal sought to give citizens direct control over laws made by the unelected office of the monarch. Each local assembly could request a referendum amongst its citizens on laws passed by the draft central government and could also, as we just discussed, approach the central government with bills to submit as draft legislation. So before I kind of conclude my analysis of this document, I do want to just say that one thing I've been interested in is just the history of referenda, popular referenda in British India. And as far as I have been able to tell, Seal's 1923 Commission is the very first document to formalize a right to referendum anywhere in the subcontinent. So as far as I've been able to, I stand to be corrected on this, but I have not found anything much prior to this. Okay, so as noted earlier, Seal presented this kind of federalist, democratic, or participatory constitution as the inheritance of a pre-modern tradition. By giving the power of lawmaking and oversight over central government actions to citizens' assemblies, he saw his constitution as the recovery of an older practice of non-electoral forms of sovereignty, of popular sovereignty. But there was also a second justification for assembly-based federalism given in the Reforms Report. And this is that throughout, Seal considered primary assemblies to be more democratic than representative electoral government. In electoral systems, he argued, lawmaking came to be confined to a limited number of elected political officials just by its very nature. So representative democracy imposed institutional constraints on the active political participation of the people as a whole. And on page 8, in an important passage on page 8 of the report, Seal argued that, quote, a vital political need is strongly felt in most countries under representative government today. The constituted central legislatures in such governments are filled in great part by representatives who come in by secondary or tertiary election, or who are thrice removed from the spheres in the interests of life they legislate upon. Owing to these inherent disadvantages of representative government by majorities, which can hardly be redressed by any scheme of proportional representation, it happens that direct action by various primary interest groups comes into, or function groups comes into the arena. So Seal's argument here was about this quote, inherent disadvantages of representative governments. And the argument was that the power of sovereignty within electoral systems came to be limited to representatives who were removed from the concerns of those they governed by the very nature of election, of secondary and tertiary election. In contrast, practices like self-government through assemblies as well as direct legislation through referenda provided a much more immediate expression of the popular will. Right? And so this is the second reason. So Seal was giving both culturalist and more avowedly Republican reasons for turning Mysore into this kind of federalist monarchy with a network of localized participatory democracy. Right? And it's one of the things that I think is interesting is the way that the historiography of Mysore as democratic sits alongside this kind of Republican political commitments, right? And this kind of mutually reinforcing more direct forms of legislation is part of the motivation for him to find that kind of system in Mysorean history, right? And so vice versa. So there's an interesting relationship between historiography and public opinion. Now, perhaps surprisingly, this draft never was integrated into law. Its democratic aspects proved too radical for the most part for the Mysore monarchy, even as they liked its support for monarchy itself. And the report's support for monarchy frustrated those in the Indian National Congress who wanted to abolish princely rule altogether and to have parliamentary government within the princely states. But the draft did become a talking point for some other nationalist circles in the 1920s. So this, again, this document is from 1923, and in August of 1923, the nationalist periodical The Modern Review ran a 7-page special feature on the Mysore Constitution. So this is a picture of a Mysore edition of the article, and hence the bad resolution. But the journal writes this really striking passage, which I just want to read out as I wrap up. And the journal says that whether we consider the population size or traditions and conditions of the United States, their future becomes hopeful only if they have this unitary constitution with a referendum and initiative in the hands of the real body of the people, the primary assemblies of the country comprising all adult citizens. This is real democracy. Otherwise, that kind of representative government, which consists in a mere parliament of intermediaries or middlemen representing the people because they manage to get themselves elected, is only a disguised oligarchy. There, the representatives soon grow into a bourgeoisie or bosses or a group of labor sabars. They form rings and caucuses with vested interests. The real people, the millions in the fields, factories, and workshops, are deprived of all share and voice in the government. Even universal adult suffrage cannot prevent this, for the middlemen or intermediary representatives manage the whole show in their own interests. And I find this a very striking article. For one thing, it is criticizing universal adult suffrage for about 4 years prior to anyone actually making a demand for universal adult suffrage in the Indian national movement, right? So it's kind of foreseeing a problem. And according to the article, Seal's plan was, if anything, more of a real democracy than any constitution that would be premised on electoral representation. The article picked up Seal's arguments about the limits on political participation under an even inclusive electoral franchise, right? And under even a system of proportional representation. The journal set itself against those strands of Indian nationalism which were demanding a parliamentary system at the provincial level, and instead it argued that this kind of system, however expansive in its electorate, would make politics into the exclusive business of a class of intermediaries. So this very juxtaposition of representative government against, quote, real democracy. Right? So this is adopting Seal's language and then developing, pushing it further. So it's really striking. This document does seem to have stirred up a conversation within nationalist political thought and discourse at the time about what a non-electoral system of popular authorization might in fact look like. But so what do we make of the text of the Constitution itself as a document in the history of 20th century political and constitutional theory? I want to end my talk today with just coming back to two main points. First, I want to return to this earlier discussion that we had about the diffusionist narrative of anti-colonial nationalism. Okay? The narrative that we have from Hannah Arendt, from Rupert Emerson, and others onward, which takes the entirety of nationalism to be a mimetic adoption of the nation-state and of representative government. Such a narrative simply cannot do justice to Seal's political vision of the 1920s. Because Seal's goal was not to replicate an established model of 20th century representative democracy at all, but rather to de-link popular sovereignty as a concept from statehood and electoral government, and to reimagine popular sovereignty in a more direct way. In many ways, I think Seal was doing exactly the opposite of what Arendt thought that anti-colonial thinkers had been doing. Right? He wasn't replicating the Japanese model. In fact, that was the model he wanted to avoid. So the fact that an anti-electoral imagination of popular sovereignty could even be articulated by a nationalist thinker in India in the 1920s, I think, should push us to rethink how we draw the relationship between anti-colonialism, between the critique of empire, between the response to empire, and the demand for political representation. Right? This relationship is not as straightforward and not as easy as I think as political scientists kind of imagined it to be. That's the first point. And then secondly, I think these kinds of texts, these kinds of lost texts within the history of political 20th century political thought, should push us to revisit widely held assumptions that we still hold about the evolution of modern democracy itself as a form of government in the 20th century. 3 decades since the publication of Samuel Huntington's Third Wave Democratization in the Late 20th Century, book I mentioned earlier, it's still the case that the story of democracy's globalization is told as a partial one, depicting the rise to prominence of one version of popular sovereignty in Western Europe and North America, and then tracking its cascade outwards. Political theorists will often hold up a modular, minimalist form of electoral representation as a distinctive historic achievement of the West since the Age of Revolutions, one that is now equally valid for all global societies. In his book, The Law of Peoples, for instance, John Rawls presents the existence of stable, multi-party liberal democracy on the Anglo-American model as an indicator of a state's political success, and indeed as an aspirational ideal for all societies struggling with democratization. That if societies are struggling with democratization, then the democracy they should adopt is this kind of multi-party liberal democracy. Such narratives both contain an element of triumphalist Eurocentrism and elide many of the structural problems produced by modern representative government, problems of citizen participation, electoral accountability, or the crises created by representative democracy's reliance on the political form of the contemporary nation-state. So I think the most significant normative upshot of studying texts from the anti-colonial federalist tradition, I think, is to be able to pluralize our understandings of democracy's global strategy, what democracy looked like as it moved beyond Europe, as it was thought about outside of Europe, and also to pluralize our understanding of the institutional forms that democracy might in fact be expected to take in the future. And I will end with that. Thank you very much, and looking forward to the discussion.
Yeah. Thanks, Tejas, for this very enlightening talk. And you have covered really a very wide range of traditions, starting from the global, Anglo-American, and anti-colonial strands and critique text. You revisit some of these strands. So I hope there would be many more questions from the audience. And now the floor is open for any question, comment, and feedback from anyone. Yes. Sorry. Yeah. Yeah.
Sir,
Would you mind introducing yourself so I can...
Yeah, just briefly your name.
sir, my name is Rohit Mahanta. I'm a PhD scholar, HSC department under the political science discipline. It's just a query, kind of a doubt. That you talked about the independent existence of Mysore's own political setup, which was studied by BNC. So, and his critique of Hegel's idea of history as linear. So, given we have given the pedigree that BNC had through Scottish Presbyterian College and then King's George Professor and then finally on to Mysore. So he had been exposed to through such mediums. He has been exposed to Western political thought, which enabled him somehow to identify this Mysore's political setup as an archetype against the dominant political system, and which he then went on to portray it as an alternative. So does it not somehow undermine his critique of Hegel's theory as Hegel's idea of history as linear, because somehow it did kind of helped him, aided him to
Come up with the critique.
come up with a critic. So that is a doubt that I have.
Yeah, that's great. That's an excellent question. Thank you, Rohit. Yes. So
Yeah, just a minute. If you like, we can have a round of question and then we can have the next round. If it is okay with you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Yes, just briefly introduce yourself. Yeah, you can speak. You can speak from there. Oh, you can speak from there.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, hello sir, my name is Neil. I'm a
You
student.
can turn the camera. Focus on it. Yeah. Yeah, fine.
Hello sir. Hello,
Yeah,
I'm
be a bit loud.
Neil. I'm a student of history at the department. I was really inquisitive regarding the utilization of this BN line seed of thought later, maybe in the 1947 moment, when the princely states were given a clear choice to join with either India or Pakistan. So I was thinking if people or maybe bureaucrats within these princely states, they were using this line of argument to counter people like Nehru or maybe Patel.
We have one more and then
Hello,
just focus. Just use the handle.
thank you for the talk, sir.
Just
I am a PhD scholar at the department. I am working in political thought, but through a perspective of gender, through a lens of gender. So, as you have presented your work through a text, and probably have called it a lost text. So, I also happen to find in archives few lost texts which are written by women organizations, by women activists and members who go on to become political leaders also in the post-independent India in the initial few decades. So I also try to sense in their writings the political. However, as you also talked somewhere about the forms and structures of the writing, not just the substance. So what I find that their substance is more inclined towards what can be referred to as social policy or the social. However, it is very much rooted in the political. So could you sort of share your thoughts regarding how can this, is there a duality between the social or the political, particularly when I am talking about the voices of the women and they are doing very political act, but their voices can be has been categorized as social, but I find it political. So is there a duality or something?
great.
so you can answer now when maybe we'll have.
Okay, great. Thank you. These are fantastic questions. Let me start, just take them in order. And the caveat I want to begin with is please no one call me sir. Okay. So let me begin with the first question about Seal's kind of intellectual formation and if that actually affects the critique of Hegel is making. Yes, it does. I think it absolutely does. I mean, this is just a dilemma. I mean, this is the kind of standard provincializing Europe argument where all critics of your critiques of Eurocentrism are kind of European in their provenance and in their language. And I think someone like Seal is actually aware of this. It's not something that he thinks you can break out of. I mean, to the extent that he thinks that the comparisons that he's able to make, that he often does make between political states in like a place like Mysore and say Japan, are not comparisons that Mysoreans themselves were making. Right, so he's kind of aware that he's imposing frameworks and languages and conceptions onto a region that the people themselves would not have necessarily recognized. But I think that actually is just a kind of a structural condition of critiques of Eurocentrism at this time. Regardless of where they are on the intellectual spectrum in the early 20th century, in the sense that they're all formed through this kind of broadly Europeanized bilingual education, as it were, but then kind of challenge Eurocentrism, and so they do that by being familiar with it. So yeah, I think he is aware of that, but he never really resolves it as an issue. The second question about the where does this go in terms of the 1947 moment in the princely state? So this is a really great question about sort of the kind of stories, and so there are two aspects here. So I think that when you see defenses of princely federation and so on in the 1930s and 40s, it's never really about democracy. There is an anti-parliamentarism there, which is, I think, is very interesting. So there is there is a language of federalism which is very strong in the princely states. Like you see that in the constitution that Hyderabad creates for itself in the 40s, for instance, right? The language of federation in particular is very strong. That's very clear. And so as part of the language of federation, there's a rejection of kind of a central parliament as the kind of repository of sovereignty. So there's that connection. As far as I know, Seal's constitution itself was never cited in the defense, but there is that connection. Now, where there's a difference is the democracy question, because it's the critique of parliamentarism doesn't necessarily need to be democratic, because it can be a critique of parliamentarism that's a defense of, say, the Nizam, which is what it ended up being, right? And I think one of the interesting things is that there's this kind of substrata of political thinking in some of the princely states, at least, which is at least aspirationally quite democratic. And it never really sees the light of day, but there is that version of anti-parliamentarism I don't think has as much influence in the 40s, because it's kind of it's not really a princely rule as such, but kind of other forms of democracy. So the other state I'll mention here, which it wasn't in the talk, but I briefly mentioned in the book, is the small princely state in what is now Maharashtra called On. It's like Gujarat, Maharashtra border. And On is this kind of idiosyncratic kind of place where Gandhi is asked to be a constitutional advisor, and they put together this kind of democratic constitution that then gets thrown out, and it's never put into practice. But it has a similar history where there's this kind of grassroots democracy focus. The value of that constitution is not so much the power of the ruler as much as this kind of local forms of decision making, but yeah, and so I don't think that story really is that important in the 40s. It kind of fades out, right? So it's really interesting to see it as an artifact of the 1920s. And then the final question, this is really, I think, a very important question, both historically and conceptually, about the relationship between the political and the social, and maybe on the specific question of gender. So the one thing let's begin with the gender question. The one thing I will say very outset that Seal does not really have seemed to thought about gender very seriously, and that's a real kind of blind spot in his thought. So there is an aspiration, as I mentioned, there's a kind of gesture towards universal adult suffrage. Right? So there's a kind of sense that gender is a bar to voting, but he doesn't have a coherent theory of gender as a kind of axis of domination, right? Which I think is also actually quite common amongst many nationalists at this time. So that's a problem. Now, what's the relationship between the political and the social as a whole? This is a very rent question, and I think one of the interesting things is about the ways that the political can be a tool for social transformation. Right? And you may have come across this in some of your own work on gender, but the ways that political participation in particular, so sort of allowing excluded populations, the sort of socially dominated populations, to be able to participate on equal terms leads first of all to them being able to demand things which they would not be able to demand in social life. Right? So the political becomes a domain of equality when the social is unequal. So that's one, I think, value of democracy that is very clear, particularly in participatory notions of democracy. That the value of democracy in an inegalitarian society is that it offers a sphere of equality which society on its own cannot offer. Right? That's one thing. And then the second thing is that there's this idea that once groups who are seen as subordinate in some way are made to participate as equals, it will lead to a gradual transformation of social norms and practices. Right? So with a lot of these thinkers in the 1910s, this really comes into the fore of questions of caste and class. Right? Like the idea that more people participating who have been historically excluded from political participation, the more people excluded from participation participate, the more you can imagine there being a change in social perceptions and social practices. So I think it's very actually interesting actually to not see the political and social as these kind of conflicting domains, but to see the political as a political, particularly the democracy, the democratic as a kind of tool for social transformation and social.
Yeah. All right. So we have one question from Dr. Vishal.
Hi, I'm Vishal. I teach sociology here. Very interesting talk. My question is coming from a certain engagement with this whole debate on decolonial theorizing, whether it be good democracy or other normative political questions. So you seem to argue that how Seal represents a certain strand of thought which doesn't see nationalism as kind of a derivative discourse. Like, so basically he's far away from the post-colonial sort of a critique also. So rather, so are you suggesting that his search for a certain conception of self and sovereignty in vernacular traditions, did he see it as some kind of an autonomous realm which is quite separate, which has a relative autonomy from the larger colonial powers? Then my question is, can we, like when we, as much as it is important to look at the ontology of such vernacular traditions, whether it be through the concept of democracy and all of that, can we see them as sort of unadulterated and untainted by the sort of colonial power, precisely because we are talking about these concepts in the context of a princely state. So then, so basically my question is regarding that, because the decolonial theorizing would not only have a sort of an epistemological critique of the Western universals, but also a radical sort of a commitment to the different ontology. So if you do you locate Seal in that context where we see this as relatively autonomous spheres of the self and sovereign, and then finally, is that what makes you title it as some sort of a radical democracy? Yeah, then how do you respond to that?
Great, thank you. The really great question. So there are two aspects of that. Let me begin in
sorry to interrupt. But before you answer, let me ask if there are few more questions. Then maybe we can wind up the talk also. Any more questions? All right, so you can go ahead and ask this. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Seems.
Okay. So I never use the word decolonial in the book or to describe anything. I have issues with that term, but my largely I would be very apprehensive about using it in this context is because Seal himself doesn't ever use the word colonialism. I mean, that's not a concept, that's not a category is ever present, right? I mean, colonialism really only enters the discourse of Indian politics with a figure like maybe Roy. I mean, it's got an economic
50s and 60s.
That I think is not present here at all. So his critique of Hegel is not a critique of kind of the coloniality of knowledge or something, maybe in a Walter Mignolo kind of sense, right? It's much more about sort of a unilinear approach to global history, to kind of global philosophy, that he sees as requiring a certain kind of assimilationist orientation, or being based on a certain kind of assimilationist. So it's not the idea ever of seeing some sort of system at play. It's more a kind of interpretive framework that he wants to challenge about how we think about the development of political forms, right? In a kind of way that takes one version of that story as it played out in Western Europe after the early modern period as representative or typical of the way that story will play out elsewhere. So that's not quite he's not really talking about colonialism or anything there. It's very specifically a critique of a certain kind of Eurocentrism, right? So I would prefer the term Eurocentrism here as the thing that is being challenged. And that gets to the untainted point as well, because I don't think he's ever really, this is a tension. I think this is a tension in a lot of these thinkers in the early 20th century, especially people who come out of the Swadeshi movement, who are really kind of preoccupied with this idea, and a lot of it is influenced by Japanese nationalism at the time. But sort of what is an Asiatic ethos for politics and so on, and it's very much in conversations. But they seem to construct these categories of Indian states, you'll remember Seal had this term Indo-Sino-Japanese, which was this series, right? This constructing this Asian family of nations. And I think that the idea that there is a kind of untainted, that they're somehow not Western is not really a thing that they're that concerned about. It's more about, even if there is kind of cross-trafficking between these kinds of cultural species, there are kind of geographical, historical, and so on reasons, factors that propel them towards distinctive trajectories. And so it's not so whether or not discrete categories, cultural categories and spaces can be seen as completely autonomous of each other, but whether or not they can be seen as having sort of following different kinds of developmental paths. So it's this early argument towards for a kind of regionalism, essentially, rather than kind of breaking out of a European way, which I think is more the sense in which some contemporary figures use. But that's really not that decolonial perspective is really not the concern here. And that's partly why I would not say that what is radical about this radical democracy project is that it's not that, right? Because that's not the framework in which these thinkers think. Why do I use radical democracy? Actually, that's part of the story in the book. So one of the reasons is that the radical democracy itself comes to be a term that's used from the 1930s onwards, when issues that Seal didn't really think about get put on the table. So the main issue that one of the things you may have gleaned from the reconstruction of the argument is that there's no real economic vision. It doesn't really have much to say about relations with property, about production, and you would imagine that any democratic theory requires an economic theory to go alongside it, but that's kind of absent from this constitution. So when you do get versions of this theory being articulated in the 1930s through Gandhi's influence and then through socialism as a kind of interlocutor, you have the idea that this kind of form of direct legislation, when combined with forms of economic equalization, will lead to a more robust form of radical democracy. So what's radical about radical democracy is the fact that it contains the political economic institution. Right? And so arguably Seal is not really radical democratic in that sense. And the reason I start with him is kind of he sets the stage for the start of this anti-parliamentarism tradition, but it becomes more radical because the kinds of democratic principles he wants to advocate for get extended into the economic domain. I think that's what radical democracy is.
Thank you.
Thanks, Tejas. So
great question.
It seems we are now come towards the end of this session. I would like to thank you, first of all, Tejas. I'm really grateful to you for accepting our invitation. It was such a fascinating and interesting talk, and we are certainly looking forward to your coming to our campus, visiting our department in person sometime in near future, and we can have perhaps more discussion around this very fascinating area of scholarship which is emerging in last, let's say, to 10 years, right? One of the striking thing which came to my mind was, a few months ago there was this debate in Indian newspapers about the death of Indian political thought. Assumption being that the dynamics of modern Indian political thought was done by the men and women actively involved in politics. But the works like yours, B.N. Seal and Rahul Sagar and many others who are retrieving like the academicians, not actually involved in the politics of the day, also thought and imagined about politics and wrote about it. And through them, we can actually, reconstruct some of the work, some of the argument to counter this very binary kind of, and also at some point, some level superficial kind of argument about only those who are active in politics imagine about politics, and those who are sitting in the academia are not producing any imaginative kind of work. So really thankful to you for opening up that window, and we look forward to your visit. Thanks, Tejas. I would also like to thank our office staff, HOD, particularly Ruhul, who took care of our this logistic, our student volunteers, and all of you for taking out your time and joining us today during this talk. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure. Thank you so much. I also hope to visit Gandhi in the near future. Thank you.
Yes, sure. You can end this.
We didn't ask him.
No, wait, it's still online. Just close it. End it.